The porcelain teacup slipped from Eleanor Westfield's trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the Green Parlor as foam gathered at the corners of her mouth. Around the mahogany table, 7 other women clutched at their throats, their expensive silk gowns darkening with sweat as convulsions overtook their bodies. Standing in the doorway with an empty silver platter, Beatrice Holloway watched the book club's final meeting with the calm expression of someone who had spent 42 years perfecting the art of invisible rebellion. The oleander she had cultivated in secret for 3 years, mixed with carefully measured arsenic from the gardening shed, had finally transformed tea and cakes into instruments of calculated vengeance. This is the story of how one enslaved woman used her knowledge of Southern hospitality to execute 8 of Savannah's most powerful women, exposing a network of cruelty that reached into every corner of Georgia society. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of April 12, 1858, arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made Savannah feel like a city wrapped in wet wool. Spanish moss hung motionless from the live oak trees lining the cobblestone drive to Pembrook Manor, their branches creating tunnels of shadow that seemed to absorb light rather than filter it. The air carried the mingled scents of magnolia blossoms and the muddy Savannah River, a combination that wealthy residents found charming but that enslaved people associated with the smell of captivity. Beatrice had risen at 4 in the morning, as she had every day since being purchased at auction in Charleston 28 years earlier. Her hands moved through the practiced choreography of breakfast preparation, cracking eggs with precision, kneading dough with the efficiency born from thousands of identical mornings. The kitchen existed as her domain within the larger prison of Pembrook Manor, a space where her expertise granted her a fragile authority that could be revoked at any moment by those who owned not just her labor but her very existence. The cast-iron stove radiated heat that turned the kitchen into a furnace even before dawn fully broke. Beatrice's calloused fingers showed no reaction to temperatures that would blister softer skin, her body having long ago adapted to the constant exposure to scalding pots and burning oven doors. She prepared the morning meal for the Pembrook family with the same meticulous attention she brought to every task, understanding that survival depended on being indispensable while remaining invisible. Through the kitchen window, she could see the first light touching the columns of the main house, illuminating architecture designed to project power and permanence. Pembrook Manor stood as a monument to cotton wealth, its white facade gleaming with fresh paint applied by enslaved hands, its gardens manicured by enslaved labor, its very existence a testament to the brutal efficiency of human bondage transformed into agricultural profit. The manor house contained 23 rooms, each decorated with furniture shipped from Europe and artwork purchased during the Pembrooks' annual trips to Paris and London. Every luxury within those walls had been purchased with money generated by people who would never be allowed to set foot in most of the spaces they maintained. The previous evening had delivered news that transformed Beatrice's careful planning from theoretical possibility into absolute necessity. Victoria Pembrook had announced during supper that Grace, Beatrice's 16-year-old daughter, would be sent to Atlanta as a personal gift to Augustus Pembrook's business associate, a cotton broker named Harrison Webb whose reputation for brutality toward enslaved women had reached even the carefully sanitized conversations of Savannah society. The transaction was described as a gesture of goodwill, a living token of appreciation for Webb's assistance in securing favorable railroad contracts for Pembrook's cotton shipments. Grace had been born in the small cabin behind the main house during a thunderstorm that knocked down 3 oak trees on the property. Beatrice had labored through the night with only the assistance of 2 other enslaved women, bringing her daughter into a world where the child's legal status as property had been determined before she drew her first breath. For 16 years, Beatrice had navigated the impossible task of raising a daughter within a system designed to prevent genuine family bonds, teaching Grace the skills necessary for survival while trying to shield her from the worst aspects of their condition. The announcement of Grace's transfer had been delivered with the casual indifference that characterized Victoria Pembrook's interactions with enslaved people. The mistress had discussed the arrangement while servants cleared dinner plates, her tone suggesting she was describing the gifting of a decorative vase rather than condemning a teenage girl to sexual slavery. Augustus Pembrook had nodded approvatively, pleased with his wife's suggestion and already calculating how the gesture would strengthen his business relationships. Neither had looked at Beatrice standing against the dining room wall, assuming that her face registered nothing more than the blank acceptance they expected from well-trained servants. But Beatrice's expression of neutral compliance masked calculations that had been developing for years. Her position as head cook granted her access to every ingredient that entered Pembrook Manor, along with the botanical knowledge she had accumulated through her secondary role as the plantation's informal healer. Enslaved people came to her kitchen for poultices and tinctures when they suffered injuries or illnesses, understanding that official medical care was reserved for those whose conditions threatened their productivity. Over decades, Beatrice had learned which plants reduced fever, which roots eased pain, and most importantly, which compounds could kill with symptoms that mimicked natural illness. The oleander bushes growing along the western fence line of the property had attracted her attention 3 years earlier, when she had witnessed a goat die after consuming the plant's leaves. The animal's death had been violent but relatively quick, its system overwhelmed by cardiac glycosides that disrupted normal heart function. Beatrice had researched the plant's properties through conversations with other enslaved people who served as healers on neighboring plantations, carefully gathering information while never revealing her ultimate intentions. She had learned that oleander's effects could be amplified when combined with other substances, that proper dosing could ensure lethality, and that the resulting symptoms might be attributed to food poisoning or natural illness if the poisoning was sophisticated enough. The arsenic had required more complex procurement. Small amounts existed in rat poison stored in the gardening shed, a substance kept under loose supervision because no one imagined that enslaved people might have reasons to steal it. Over 18 months, Beatrice had extracted minuscule quantities during her early morning routines, amounts small enough to avoid detection but sufficient, when accumulated, to create a lethal dose when properly prepared. The theft required extraordinary patience, each tiny portion representing a calculated risk that could result in immediate execution if discovered. Her knowledge of dosing had been refined through careful observation and experimentation that she could never discuss with anyone. She had tested minute quantities on the rats that infested the slave quarters, observing their reactions and adjusting her calculations accordingly. The mathematics of death required precision that left no room for error, understanding that insufficient amounts might cause illness without achieving lethality, while excessive doses might trigger immediate symptoms that would allow victims to seek help before the poison completed its work. The book club provided the perfect opportunity for her plan's execution. Victoria Pembrook hosted the gathering monthly, welcoming 7 other women from Savannah's elite families to discuss literature, politics, and social matters while consuming elaborate refreshments prepared by Beatrice. The meetings followed a rigid schedule, beginning at 2 in the afternoon and concluding by 5, with specific expectations regarding the quality and presentation of food. Victoria prided herself on offering superior hospitality, using these gatherings to demonstrate her refined tastes and the efficiency of her household management. The 8 women who comprised the book club represented a cross-section of Savannah power structures. Eleanor Westfield's husband. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Controlled the largest bank in Georgia, making decisions about credit and foreclosure that determined which plantations thrived and which failed. Judith Carrington had married a judge whose courtroom had sentenced dozens of enslaved people to brutal punishments for infractions ranging from theft to attempted escape. Lydia Thornton's position as the mayor's wife granted her influence over city policies that maintained the legal architecture of slavery. Charlotte Ashford attended the gatherings straight from accompanying her senator husband to legislative sessions where laws reinforcing racial hierarchy were debated and passed. Harriet Dunmore represented railroad wealth, her husband's transportation networks enabling the expansion of slavery into new territories by connecting plantations to distant markets. Abigail Sutton had access to cotton industry intelligence through her husband's brokerage firm, information that shaped economic policies affecting thousands of enslaved workers. Constance Fairchild wielded perhaps the most insidious influence through her husband's newspaper, which published articles defending slavery as a benevolent institution and characterizing enslaved people as childlike creatures incapable of self-governance. And Victoria Pembrook herself orchestrated the entire social ecosystem, using her position to reinforce the behavioral expectations and moral justifications that sustained Savannah's slaveholding class. These women viewed themselves as paragons of Christian virtue and cultural refinement. Their book club selections included novels celebrating noble suffering and religious texts emphasizing obedience to earthly masters. They discussed literature while sipping tea prepared by people they owned, finding no contradiction between their appreciation for artistic beauty and their participation in systematic human degradation. Their conversations often included complaints about the difficulties of managing household staff, shared with the assumption that the servants standing against the walls couldn't comprehend the casual cruelty embedded in every word. Beatrice had served these women for 8 years, watching their patterns and learning their preferences with the attention to detail that survival required. She knew that Eleanor Westfield preferred her tea lukewarm and heavily sweetened, that Judith Carrington avoided anything with nuts due to digestive sensitivity, that Lydia Thornton always consumed 3 cakes regardless of flavor. This knowledge, accumulated through years of invisible observation, would ensure that her plan accounted for individual variations while achieving uniform results. The morning of April 12 found Beatrice in her kitchen domain, preparing the refreshments that would transform a literary gathering into a mass execution. The lemon cakes required precise measurements of flour, sugar, butter, and eggs, ingredients she had requisitioned from the pantry without arousing any suspicion. Her hands worked the batter with practiced efficiency while her mind tracked the more dangerous preparations happening in parallel. The oleander extract, prepared over the previous week through a careful reduction process, waited in a small vial hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The arsenic, ground into powder fine enough to dissolve completely in liquid, rested in a separate container that showed no external markings that might betray its contents. The integration of poison into food required techniques Beatrice had rehearsed mentally for months. The oleander would be mixed into the lemon glaze that topped each cake, its bitter taste masked by citrus and sugar in proportions she had calculated to ensure palatability despite the toxic addition. The arsenic would be dissolved into the lavender-infused tea, its presence concealed by the strong floral notes that the book club members found sophisticated. The dual compound approach ensured redundancy, guaranteeing lethality even if one poison proved less effective than anticipated. As Beatrice worked, her daughter Grace entered the kitchen carrying firewood for the stove. The girl's resemblance to her mother was unmistakable in the set of her jaw and the intelligence visible in her eyes, features that had attracted dangerous attention from Augustus Pembrook and led to the announcement of her impending transfer to Atlanta. Grace moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone trained from childhood in domestic labor, stacking wood with geometric precision and checking water levels in the various pots simmering on the stove. Mother and daughter exchanged no words about the previous evening's announcement. The kitchen existed under constant potential surveillance, with white family members or their trusted overseers liable to appear without warning. Conversations about anything beyond immediate tasks carried risks that had been drilled into both women through years of punishment witnessed or experienced. But Grace's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the firewood, and Beatrice's expression softened for just a moment before resuming its mask of neutral competence. The preparation of lethal refreshments continued through the morning with methodical precision. Each lemon cake emerged from the oven with perfect golden coloring, their surfaces smooth and appealing. The glaze application required steady hands and complete focus, ensuring even distribution of the poison coating across every surface. Beatrice worked alone during this crucial phase, having sent Grace to perform laundry duties that would keep her away from the kitchen and establish her absence from any later investigation into how the poisoning had occurred. The tea preparation followed established protocols for the lavender infusion that Victoria Pembrook had declared her signature beverage. Fresh lavender from the garden was steeped in boiling water, creating an aromatic base that Beatrice strained through cheesecloth before adding the dissolved arsenic. The resulting liquid showed no visible contamination, its pale purple color and strong floral scent masking the presence of compounds that would soon stop 8 hearts from beating. She prepared the tea in the silver pot reserved exclusively for book club gatherings, a vessel that would later be examined for evidence but would reveal nothing beyond traces of its usual contents. By noon, the refreshments stood ready on the kitchen counter, arranged on the finest china that Pembrook Manor owned. The presentation met every standard of Southern hospitality, with lemon cakes positioned at precise intervals on a three-tiered serving platter, the poison glaze glistening under afternoon light filtering through the kitchen windows. The teapot waited beside delicate cups hand-painted with rose patterns, each piece of the service representing more wealth than most enslaved people would see in their entire lives. The contrast between the beauty of the presentation and the lethality of its contents would have struck an outside observer as grotesque, but Beatrice felt only the cold satisfaction of a plan reaching its culmination. The book club members began arriving at 1:30, their carriages creating a procession up the Oak Line Drive. Each woman wore afternoon dress that demonstrated both wealth and the rigid fashion expectations of Savannah society. Eleanor Westfield emerged from her carriage in emerald silk that had been shipped from France, the fabric alone costing more than what most families earned in a year. Judith Carrington's burgundy gown featured hand-embroidered details that had required months of skilled labor. Lydia Thornton's cream-colored dress showcased the latest style from London, its elaborate construction requiring assistance from multiple servants just to put on or remove. The women gathered in the Green Parlor with the comfortable entitlement of people who had never questioned their right to occupy beautiful spaces. The room itself represented the pinnacle of Savannah interior design, with walls painted in a shade of sage that complemented the Persian rugs covering heart pine floors. Oil paintings depicting pastoral European scenes hung in gilded frames, their subjects bearing no resemblance to the Georgia landscape visible through tall windows draped in velvet curtains. Crystal chandeliers refracted afternoon sunlight into rainbow patterns that danced across surfaces polished to mirror brightness by enslaved hands. Victoria Pembrook positioned herself at the head of the gathering, her posture radiating the authority of a woman accustomed to orchestrating social rituals. She wore a gown of deep violet that emphasized her status as hostess, its intricate beadwork catching light with every movement. Her jewelry consisted of pearls harvested from waters thousands of miles away, their lustrous surfaces representing wealth extracted from human suffering and transformed into ornamental beauty. She surveyed her guests with satisfaction, mentally cataloging how each woman's presence enhanced her own social standing. The conversation before tea service followed predictable patterns established over years of identical gatherings. Eleanor Westfield discussed her recent trip to Charleston, describing shops and theaters with the detailed enthusiasm of someone whose freedom of movement was so absolute she never considered it a privilege. Judith Carrington complained about household management challenges, her stories about disobedient servants told with the expectation of sympathetic agreement from women who shared similar frustrations. Lydia Thornton mentioned her husband's upcoming political campaign, soliciting support that would be delivered through their husband's business connections and social influence. Charlotte Ashford brought news from the state capitol, reporting on legislative debates with the inside knowledge that came from pillow talk with a senator. Her account of proposed laws strengthening fugitive slave provisions received enthusiastic approval from the other women, who viewed such measures as necessary protections for their property rights. Harriet Dunmore contributed railroad expansion gossip, explaining how new routes would open additional territories to cotton cultivation and therefore increase demand for enslaved labor. Abigail Sutton analyzed cotton market trends with the expertise of someone who received daily briefings from her broker husband, predicting price movements that would determine plantation profitability across the region. Constance Fairchild dominated much of the pre-tea conversation with accounts of her husband's newspaper's recent editorial successes. She described with particular pride a series of articles refuting Northern abolitionist arguments, pieces that characterized slavery as a civilizing force that rescued Africans from heathen barbarism. The other women praised these publications enthusiastically, viewing them as crucial contributions to the moral defense of their way of life. None of them noticed the irony of discussing enslaved people's supposed inferiority while being served by Beatrice, whose competence exceeded their own in every practical domain. The book selection for April's meeting was a romantic novel set in medieval England, chosen specifically because its content had no connection to contemporary political controversies. The women preferred literature that transported them to worlds of noble knights and virtuous ladies, stories that reinforced their self-image as refined creatures deserving of the luxuries their husbands' business dealings provided. Their discussion of the novel focused on fashion descriptions and courtship rituals, analyzing fictional relationships with the same seriousness they might bring to actual historical events. Victoria Pembrook eventually steered conversation toward the refreshments, announcing that today's offering would feature her cook's famous lemon cakes and a new lavender tea preparation. Her pride in presenting superior hospitality was evident in her tone, the quality of refreshments serving as another metric by which she could demonstrate supremacy over her social peers. She rang a small silver bell to summon Beatrice from the kitchen, the tinkling sound carrying authority that required no verbal reinforcement. Beatrice entered the Green Parlor carrying the three-tiered serving platter with the steady hands of someone who had performed this exact task dozens of times. Her expression maintained the neutral mask that white families expected from competent servants, showing neither excessive deference nor any hint of independent thought. She wore a clean apron over her work dress, her appearance meeting the standards of invisibility that allowed her to move through white spaces without triggering discomfort or unwanted attention. The poison cakes gleamed on their china platform, their lemon glaze catching afternoon light in ways that made them appear even more appetizing. She placed the platter on the central table with precise movements, ensuring that each cake occupied its designated position. The arrangement followed aesthetic principles Victoria had drilled into her through years of criticism and occasional physical punishment for presentation failures. Beatrice then returned to the kitchen for the tea service, her departure from the parlor creating a brief interval during which the women could comment on the refreshments without concern for servant sensibilities. The tea arrived moments later in the ornate silver pot, accompanied by the hand-painted cups that Victoria reserved for special occasions. Beatrice poured each cup with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that even minor spills would result in punishment, the lavender-infused liquid flowing in smooth arcs from spout to porcelain. The floral aroma filled the parlor, mingling with perfumes worn by the assembled women to create a scent profile that represented southern gentility at its most refined. The arsenic dissolved within the tea remained completely undetectable, its presence masked by ingredients selected specifically for their ability to conceal lethal additions. Victoria took the first sip, closing her eyes to savor the flavor profile with the concentrated attention of a connoisseur. Her expression registered approval, and she nodded to Beatrice in acknowledgement of successful execution. The other women followed her lead, raising cups to lips painted with rouge imported from Paris, each sip bringing them closer to the consequences Beatrice had calculated with mathematical precision. The tea's temperature had been calibrated to encourage relatively quick consumption, warm enough to release the lavender essence but cool enough to drink without extended waiting periods. The lemon cakes disappeared from the serving platter with gratifying speed. Eleanor Westfield consumed hers in delicate bites, commenting on the perfect balance between citrus tartness and sugar sweetness. Judith Carrington finished her portion quickly and reached for a second, her appetite undiminished by the multiple courses she had consumed at lunch. Lydia Thornton ate exactly 3 cakes as predicted, her consumption patterns as reliable as clockwork. Each woman's ingestion of poison refreshments proceeded according to behavioral patterns Beatrice had observed and documented over years of service. Conversation continued uninterrupted as the women consumed their fatal refreshments. They discussed an upcoming charity bazaar that would raise funds for missionary work in Africa, the irony of supporting African evangelization while enslaving African descendants completely lost on participants. Plans were made for a summer garden party that would showcase Victoria's landscaping improvements, events that required months of enslaved labor to prepare but would be credited entirely to the mistress's refined aesthetic vision. The normalcy of their discussion created a surreal contrast with the biological processes beginning within their bodies as cardiac glycosides and arsenic entered bloodstreams and started disrupting cellular functions. Beatrice remained in the parlor throughout the consumption phase, standing against the wall in the position designated for servants awaiting additional instructions. Her presence was so normalized that the women discussed private matters with no more restraint than if they had been completely alone. She heard Charlotte Ashford mention her husband's mistress with weary resignation, acknowledging the relationship as an inevitable aspect of male nature that wives were expected to tolerate. She listened to Harriet Dunmore describe punishments inflicted on enslaved workers who had failed to meet productivity quotas, the casual cruelty delivered in the same tone used to discuss weather patterns or dress fabrics. The first symptom appeared approximately 20 minutes after initial consumption. Eleanor Westfield paused mid-sentence, her hand rising to touch her throat with confused concern. She attempted to continue her thought but found herself struggling with words that seemed to require more effort than normal to produce. The other women initially dismissed her difficulty as a minor cough or perhaps a cake crumb causing temporary irritation. Eleanor herself attributed the sensation to nothing more serious than seasonal allergies, having no framework for understanding that her cardiac system was beginning to fail under the assault of compounds designed specifically to stop hearts from beating. Judith Carrington experienced the next visible symptom, a sudden flush spreading across her face and neck like spilled wine soaking into fabric. She fanned herself vigorously, complaining about the parlor's temperature and requesting that windows be opened to admit fresh air. Victoria accommodated the request immediately, attributing her guests' discomfort to the unseasonable humidity that made April feel more like July. The open windows admitted a breeze-carrying sense of magnolia and river mud, providing momentary relief that did nothing to address the actual cause of distress. Lydia Thornton's hands began trembling as she attempted to raise her teacup for another sip. The delicate china rattled against its saucer, creating a sound that drew concerned attention from the other women. Lydia laughed nervously, attributing the tremor to excessive coffee consumption earlier in the day, an explanation that seemed plausible enough to prevent immediate alarm. She set down the cup carefully, her movements becoming more deliberate as fine motor control began degrading under neurological assault. The symptoms cascaded with increasing rapidity as the poison achieved sufficient concentration in bloodstreams. Charlotte Ashford complained of visual disturbances, describing how the room seemed to be moving in ways that defied physical possibility. Harriet Dunmore experienced sudden nausea, her complexion shifting from flushed to pallid in moments. Abigail Sutton's breathing became labored, each inhalation requiring visible effort as her respiratory system struggled against compounds designed to disrupt normal function. Constance Fairchild tried to stand but found her legs unresponsive, her attempt to rise resulting in an ungainly collapse back into her chair. Victoria Pembrook, whose slightly delayed consumption meant symptoms manifested a few minutes behind the others, initially attempted to maintain social order in the face of inexplicable mass illness. She rang the bell to summon additional servants, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having problems resolved through the application of sufficient help. But even as she issued commands, her own body began exhibiting signs of systemic failure. Her speech slurred mid-instruction, words becoming garbled in ways that suggested neurological compromise rather than simple confusion. The parlor transformed from a scene of genteel refinement into something resembling a battlefield medical station. 8 women in expensive gowns writhed in various stages of distress, their carefully maintained composure dissolving as bodies rebelled against biological imperatives. The contrast between their ornamental presentation and their current degradation would have been darkly comic if the stakes were not measured in lives ending. Silk and velvet became soiled with sweat and vomit as digestive systems rejected their poison contents. Jewelry remained pristine on bodies that were shutting down, pearls gleaming on throats where pulses raced and stuttered. Beatrice remained motionless in her designated position, her expression maintaining the neutral mask even as chaos erupted around her. Her lack of visible reaction was itself a kind of statement, a refusal to perform the expected servant panic that would have been appropriate for someone witnessing inexplicable mass illness. Other household servants arrived in response to Victoria's bell and began attempting to provide assistance, their efforts hampered by not understanding what was causing the symptoms they were trying to address. Augustus Pembroke burst into the parlor after being summoned from his study, his face registering shock at the scene confronting him. 8 women, including his wife, in various states of medical crisis, their symptoms suggesting severe poisoning but from sources he could not immediately identify. His first instinct was to send writers for Dr. Marcus Brennan, the physician whose practice served Savannah's elite families. His second thought, revealing the priorities that govern his worldview, was to worry about the social embarrassment of having 8 prominent women fall ill while under his roof in hospitality. Dr. Brennan arrived within 30 minutes, his medical bag containing instruments and medications that would prove entirely inadequate for treating advanced poisoning by multiple compounds. He moved from patient to patient, taking pulses and examining symptoms with growing concern that manifested in the tightening of his jaw and the furrows deepening across his forehead. His training had prepared him for individual cases of accidental poisoning, typically from tainted food or medication errors, but nothing in his experience matched the presentation of 8 simultaneous victims exhibiting identical symptom progression. Eleanor Westfield was the first to die, her heart simply stopping despite Brennan's attempts to stimulate continued function through various interventions. The moment of death was marked by a final convulsion that arched her back against the chair where servants had positioned her, followed by an absolute stillness that signaled the transition from living person to corpse. The doctor checked for pulse with professional thoroughness before pronouncing her deceased, his voice carrying the strain of someone confronting medical failure on an unprecedented scale. Judith Carrington followed within minutes, her own cardiac arrest occurring while Brennan was still processing Eleanor's death. The rapid succession of fatalities created an atmosphere of panic that spread beyond the parlor to other parts of the house as servants rushed to communicate the unfolding disaster. Lydia Thornton died while the doctor was attempting to induce vomiting in Charlotte Ashford, the treatment proving futile because too much poison had already been absorbed into systemic circulation. Charlotte herself expired before the emetic could take full effect, her body rejecting the intervention as firmly as it was rejecting continued life. Harriet Dunmore's death was particularly violent, her final moments marked by convulsions that required 3 servants to prevent her from injuring herself against furniture. Abigail Sutton slipped away more quietly, her breathing becoming progressively shallower until it ceased entirely. Constance Fairchild remained conscious longer than the others, her final words a confused question about what was happening, as if her mind could not process the reality of her own mortality. Victoria Pembrook died last, her position as hostess extending even to the order of expiration, her final breath escaping as a sigh that seemed to carry recognition of absolute failure. The Green Parlor, which had hosted countless gatherings celebrating Southern refinement and cultural superiority, now contained 8 corpses arranged in various positions of death. The contrast between the room's decorative beauty and its current function as a temporary morgue created a tableau that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Crystal chandeliers continued refracting sunlight across surfaces now contaminated by the physical evidence of mass death. Persian rugs absorbed fluids that would leave permanent stains despite any cleaning efforts. The refreshments that had delivered death remained on their serving platter, lemon glaze glistening innocently above compounds that had stopped 8 hearts from beating. Dr. Brennan stood in the center of carnage, his medical training inadequate preparation for the emotional weight of watching 8 patients die despite his interventions. His hands still trembled from the adrenaline of failed rescue attempts, his mind already beginning the process of analyzing symptoms to determine cause of death. The simultaneous nature of the illness pointed definitively toward poisoning, but identifying the specific agent would require examination of the refreshments and potentially autopsy of the victims to analyze stomach contents and tissue samples. Augustus Pembroke's shock transformed into rage as the implications of the disaster became clear. 8 of Savannah's most prominent women had died under his roof, their deaths certain to trigger investigations that would scrutinize every aspect of his household management. The social consequences alone would be devastating, his family's reputation permanently stained by association with mass death. But more immediately threatening were the legal ramifications, the potential for criminal prosecution if the poisoning was determined to be intentional rather than accidental contamination. His eyes found Beatrice still standing in her designated position against the parlor wall, her presence suddenly taking on sinister significance. The cook who had prepared the fatal refreshments, who had access to every ingredient and complete control over food preparation, who had served the poison items with her own hands. The connection between her role and the deaths required no elaborate detective work, the causal chain running directly from kitchen to corpses with Beatrice as the obvious link. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell arrived as twilight settled over Savannah, summoned by writers who had spread news of the mass deaths through the city with remarkable speed. He entered Pembrook Manor to find controlled chaos, servants attempting to restore order while the bodies remained where they had fallen pending official investigation. The sheriff was a practical man whose election depended on maintaining good relationships with families like those represented by the 8 corpses, and he understood immediately that this case would define his career for better or worse. His examination of the scene began with the refreshments, the lemon cakes and lavender tea that represented the only common factor consumed by all victims. Dr. Brennan provided preliminary findings suggesting poisoning by substances that affected cardiac and neurological function, though specific identification would require laboratory analysis beyond local capabilities. The symptom timeline indicated that toxins had acted with remarkable efficiency, suggesting either highly concentrated doses or particularly lethal compounds. Caldwell's questioning of household servants produced consistent accounts pointing toward Beatrice as the sole person responsible for refreshment preparation. Multiple witnesses confirmed that she had worked alone in the kitchen during the crucial hours, that she had personally served both tea and cakes, that she had remained in the parlor throughout the consumption phase. The circumstantial evidence built toward a conclusion that seemed obvious despite the unprecedented nature of the crime. The sheriff found Beatrice in the kitchen where she had returned after the parlor descended into chaos. She sat on a wooden stool near the cold stove, her hands folded in her lap, her expression maintaining the same neutral mask she had worn throughout the afternoon's events. Caldwell approached with the wariness of someone confronting a person who had just demonstrated capacity for mass murder, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt even though Beatrice showed no signs of resistance or flight. The arrest proceeded with formal efficiency, Caldwell reciting charges while applying iron shackles that had been designed specifically for restraining enslaved people. The weight of the metal against Beatrice's wrists represented a familiar sensation, her lifetime of bondage having included numerous instances of physical restraint for infractions real and imagined. But these shackles carried different implications, marking her transition from property accused of destroying other property to a criminal defendant facing execution for crimes that challenged the fundamental social order. News of the mass poisoning spread through Savannah with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. By the time Caldwell transported Beatrice to the county jail, crowds had gathered along the route, their faces showing mixtures of shock, fear, and rage. White residents viewed the crime as confirmation of their darkest fears about enslaved people's potential for violence if allowed opportunity. Enslaved people observed the arrest with carefully concealed reactions, understanding that Beatrice's actions and their consequences would affect everyone who shared her legal status. The jail cell where Beatrice was confined had been constructed specifically for holding enslaved people awaiting punishment or sale, its design prioritizing security over any pretense of humane conditions. Stone walls wept moisture in Savannah's humidity, creating an environment that encouraged disease and despair. A single barred window admitted minimal light and no fresh air. The sleeping platform consisted of wooden planks without bedding, the assumption being that people classified as property deserved no comfort while awaiting their fate. Beatrice's first night in custody passed in silence, broken only by sounds filtering from the city beyond her cell. She heard church bells marking hours, their regular rhythm measuring time in a way that seemed disconnected from her current reality. She heard voices of jailers discussing her case, their speculation about motives and methods delivered with the casual tone of people analyzing an interesting puzzle rather than a human tragedy. She heard rain beginning to fall, drops pattering against stone in patterns that reminded her of kitchen sounds from a life that had ended the moment she decided Grace's survival justified 8 deaths. The investigation into the poisoning continued through the night as Dr. Brennan conducted preliminary examinations of the bodies and Sheriff Caldwell secured the kitchen and its contents for evidence. The lemon cakes and remaining tea were carefully packaged for transport to chemists who might identify specific poisons used. Every ingredient in Beatrice's kitchen came under scrutiny, investigators searching for substances that could have produced the observed symptoms. The methodical documentation of evidence proceeded with unusual thoroughness, driven by recognition that this case would attract attention far beyond Savannah's boundaries. Grace learned of her mother's arrest through the slave quarter communication network, the news reaching her while she folded laundry in a building separated from the main house. Her immediate reaction combined grief and terror, understanding that Beatrice's actions had been motivated by attempt to prevent Grace's transfer to Atlanta but that the consequence would likely be public execution designed to terrorize other enslaved people. The mathematical cruelty of the situation was inescapable, one form of violence answered by another, neither offering genuine salvation. The morning of April 13 arrived with Savannah transformed by news of the mass poisoning. Businesses closed as owners gathered to discuss implications. Churches scheduled special services to pray for the victims and seek divine guidance in troubled times. The newspaper owned by Constance Fairchild's widower prepared a special edition that would characterize the poisoning as evidence of inherent African savagery requiring stricter controls on enslaved populations. Every institution in the city oriented itself around an event that threatened to expose contradictions in the ideology sustaining their way of life. Beatrice received her first visitor in the form of attorney Daniel Fletcher, a young lawyer appointed by the court to provide defense representation as required by Georgia law even for enslaved defendants. Fletcher had never handled a capital case and found himself assigned to defend someone accused of the most sensational crime in state history. He entered the cell with obvious nervousness, his legal training inadequate preparation for confronting someone who had committed mass murder in service of protecting her daughter. Their conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, Fletcher asking perfunctory questions about Beatrice's account of events while she maintained silence that offered no cooperation or resistance. The lawyer's discomfort was palpable, his understanding that his role required mounting some form of defense conflicting with his personal horror at the crime and his professional recognition that no legal argument would prevent conviction. He left the cell with nothing useful for building a defense strategy, his legal pad containing only notes documenting Beatrice's refusal to engage with the process designed to determine her fate. The chemist's report arrived at Sheriff Caldwell's office 3 days after the poisoning, its findings delivered in technical language that required translation for legal proceedings but left no doubt about the cause of death. The laboratory analysis had identified cardiac glycosides consistent with oleander poisoning, along with arsenic concentrations sufficient to prove lethal intent rather than accidental contamination. The dual compound approach demonstrated sophistication that challenged assumptions about enslaved people's intellectual capabilities, forcing investigators to confront evidence of premeditation and scientific knowledge that contradicted every comforting myth about African inferiority. The remnants of lemon cake showed oleander extract concentrated in the glaze at levels calculated to ensure lethality across a range of body weights and individual tolerances. The precision of dosing suggested someone with extensive botanical knowledge and access to reference materials that supposedly existed beyond the reach of enslaved populations. The tea analysis revealed arsenic dissolved at concentrations designed to complement the oleander's cardiac effects, creating a synergistic toxicity that overwhelmed natural defense mechanisms. Together, the compounds represented a murder weapon as sophisticated as any poison deployed by trained assassins in European courts. Dr. Brennan's autopsy reports corroborated the chemical findings with detailed descriptions of tissue damage consistent with the identified toxins. Hearts showed cellular destruction indicating glycoside interference with normal electrical conductivity. Livers displayed damage patterns matching arsenic exposure. Stomach contents confirmed that all 8 victims had consumed sufficient quantities of both compounds to make survival impossible even with immediate medical intervention. The medical evidence left no ambiguity about cause of death or the intentional nature of the poisoning. The grand jury convened with unusual speed, political pressure from grieving families accelerating legal processes that normally moved at glacial pace. District Attorney Henry Whitmore presented evidence to jurors selected specifically for their property ownership and social standing, men whose economic interests aligned completely with maintaining the system that Beatrice's crime had challenged. The proceedings lasted less than 2 hours, the outcome predetermined by the nature of the charges and the race of the defendant. The indictment for 8 counts of murder was delivered with language emphasizing the unprecedented threat to social order represented by enslaved resistance. Beatrice's trial was scheduled for early May, the compressed timeline reflecting both public demand for swift justice and official desire to resolve the case before summer heat made courthouse proceedings unbearable. The date announcement triggered preparations throughout Savannah as the city braced for proceedings that would attract attention from across Georgia and beyond. Hotels filled with visitors hoping to witness history, their presence transforming a local tragedy into a spectacle that revealed as much about spectator psychology as about the crime itself. The slave quarters at Pembrook Manor existed under heightened surveillance following Beatrice's arrest, white overseers recognizing that mass poisoning might inspire additional acts of resistance if not countered with overwhelming shows of force. James Garrett, the overseer whose cruelty had earned him employment on multiple plantations, instituted new restrictions on movement and communication. Enslaved people found their already limited freedoms further constrained. Punishments for minor infractions increased to remind everyone of the consequences awaiting those who followed Beatrice's example. Grace continued her work in the laundry despite her mother's imprisonment, her presence at Pembrook Manor serving multiple purposes for Augustus Pembrook. She represented potential leverage in case Beatrice decided to provide testimony about accomplices or co-conspirators. Her continued enslavement demonstrated that the plantation's operations would proceed normally despite recent disruptions. Most cynically, her availability preserved the option of completing the planned transfer to Harrison Webb in Atlanta, the business arrangement still requiring fulfillment regardless of intervening events. The young woman moved through her duties with mechanical efficiency, her emotional state carefully hidden beneath a mask of compliance that mirrored her mother's lifelong performance. She washed clothing belonging to the family that owned her, scrubbing stains from fabric worth more than her legal market value, performing labor that generated wealth she would never touch. The irony of cleaning garments for people who had condemned her mother to death while planning her own sexual enslavement was not lost on Grace, but survival required suppressing such observations beneath layers of protective numbness. Reverend Patrick Morrison, who had served as spiritual advisor to the book club and maintained close relationships with all 8 victims, struggled with theological questions raised by the mass poisoning. His sermons in the weeks following the deaths attempted to reconcile Christian principles with slavery's brutal realities, seeking scriptural justification for a social system that produced outcomes like 8 corpses in a parlor. He preached about forgiveness while advocating for Beatrice's execution, about mercy while supporting laws that classified humans as property, about divine justice while defending earthly injustice. The Reverend's theological gymnastics reflected broader contradictions within Southern religious thought. Churches across Savannah held special services mourning the victims while celebrating slavery as divinely ordained. Preachers cited biblical passages about servants obeying masters while ignoring verses about treating others as you wish to be treated. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain both Christian identity and slaveholder status produced sermons that would have been comedic if the stakes were not measured in human suffering. Private correspondence between the victims' families revealed fault lines in Savannah's social structure that the poisoning had exposed. Letters exchanged between widowers showed some questioning whether their wives' involvement in plantation management might have contributed to the tragedy. Eleanor Westfield's husband admitted in private writing that his wife had been unusually cruel in her treatment of household servants, her behavior possibly motivating the very resistance that led to her death. Such admissions remained carefully contained within elite circles, never spoken publicly where they might undermine the narrative of innocent victims murdered by savage perpetrators. Judith Carrington's widower hired private investigators to examine Beatrice's background, seeking evidence of prior violent incidents or connections to abolitionist networks. The investigation produced detailed records of her purchase in Charleston, her transfer to Pembrook Manor, her exemplary service record spanning nearly 3 decades. No evidence emerged of previous resistance or connection to organized opposition movements. The findings suggested that Beatrice had acted independently based on immediate circumstances rather than as part of broader conspiracy, a conclusion that somehow made her crime more threatening by demonstrating that individual enslaved people might choose violence without external instigation. The financial implications of the mass poisoning extended beyond immediate grief as families confronted practical consequences of losing wives who had managed household operations and social networks. Lydia Thornton's absence created chaos in her husband's political campaigns, the mayor discovering too late how much his electoral success had depended on his wife's behind-the-scenes organizing. Charlotte Ashford's widower faced difficulties maintaining relationships with colleagues who had been cultivated through his wife's strategic dinner parties and social events. The deaths revealed how much of Southern elite society's functioning depended on women's unpaid labor in maintaining networks that sustained male power. Harriet Dunmore's railroad magnate husband announced plans to endow a hospital wing in his wife's memory, the charitable gesture serving multiple purposes including tax advantages and social rehabilitation of his family's reputation. The proposed facility would treat white patients exclusively, its mission statement emphasizing the preservation of civilization against forces of chaos represented by crimes like Beatrice's. The hospital project attracted support from other widowers seeking visible ways to memorialize victims while reinforcing racial hierarchies. Abigail Sutton's cotton broker husband discovered evidence among his wife's papers suggesting she had been aware of systematic theft by household servants but had chosen not to report it to avoid the social embarrassment of admitting her supervision had been inadequate. The revelation that minor crimes had been occurring undetected fueled paranoia about what other threats might be lurking within seemingly well-managed households. Insurance companies began offering policies protecting against property damage caused by enslaved workers, the new financial instruments treating human resistance as natural disaster requiring economic hedging. Constance Fairchild's newspaper continued publishing under new editorial management, its coverage of the upcoming trial emphasizing themes of racial threat and the necessity of harsh punishment to maintain order. The publication's influence shaped public opinion throughout Georgia, its articles reprinted in papers across the South as evidence of the dangers posed by insufficiently controlled enslaved populations. Editorials called for legislative action strengthening laws governing enslaved people's behavior and expanding penalties for resistance of any kind. Victoria Pembrook's death left Augustus as sole manager of the plantation, a responsibility he had previously shared with his wife in ways he only recognized after her absence. The couple's division of labor had assigned household management entirely to Victoria, her death revealing how little Augustus understood about the daily operations that sustained his lifestyle. His attempts to hire a replacement household manager produced complications as potential candidates proved unwilling to work in a house associated with mass murder, their reluctance forcing him to confront the lasting consequences of Beatrice's actions. The financial records Victoria had maintained showed systematic discrepancies that Augustus discovered while attempting to understand household accounts. Money allocated for food purchases exceeded reasonable expectations, suggesting either fraud by suppliers or embezzlement by household staff. The amounts were significant enough to represent serious theft but minor enough to have escaped notice during Victoria's lifetime. Augustus faced the choice of investigating discrepancies that might reveal embarrassing management failures or ignoring evidence of crimes that suddenly seemed trivial compared to 8 poisoning deaths. Dr. Brennan's medical practice experienced unexpected consequences from his association with the poisoning case. Patients began questioning his competence after his inability to save any of the 8 victims despite being summoned while several were still alive. His explanations about the poisoning's sophistication and the impossibility of treating unknown toxins without proper diagnosis failed to satisfy families who expected medical professionals to perform miracles. His income declined as prominent patients transferred to other physicians, the financial impact forcing him to accept clients from lower social classes he had previously avoided. The doctor's personal crisis extended beyond professional reputation to existential questions about his role in sustaining slavery. His practice had always included treating enslaved people for injuries and illnesses, his medical interventions enabling their continued exploitation by maintaining their working capacity. Brennan had never questioned this aspect of his work until forced to confront a case where medical knowledge had been weaponized by an enslaved woman with sufficient botanical expertise to create untreatable poisons. The reversal challenged his assumptions about who possessed scientific knowledge and for what purposes such knowledge might be deployed. Sheriff Caldwell's investigation into the poisoning's origins traced Beatrice's movements over the preceding months, attempting to identify when and how she had acquired the materials used in her crime. Interviews with other enslaved people produced careful testimonies that revealed nothing useful, each witness understanding that cooperation with authorities might mark them as traitors within their own community. The conspiracy of silence frustrated investigators but demonstrated solidarity networks that operated invisibly within enslaved populations. The search of Beatrice's cabin yielded materials suggesting extensive self-education beyond what white society believed enslaved people capable of achieving. Books on plants and their properties, carefully hidden behind loose boards, showed evidence of study through marginal notes written in surprisingly sophisticated handwriting. Dried plant specimens labeled with their properties indicated systematic collection and cataloging of botanical knowledge. The discoveries forced investigators to confront evidence that Beatrice possessed intellectual capabilities that contradicted fundamental assumptions about racial inferiority. Attorney Fletcher attempted to build a defense strategy despite his client's continued refusal to cooperate or provide any account of events. His legal research identified no precedents for defending enslaved people accused of murdering their owners, much less multiple victims simultaneously. Georgia law provided minimal protections for enslaved defendants, the statutes assuming that property accused of destroying other property would receive perfunctory legal proceedings before inevitable execution. Fletcher's ethical obligations required mounting some defense, but his practical assessment concluded that no legal argument would prevent conviction. The lawyer's meetings with Beatrice in her cell grew progressively shorter as he recognized the futility of seeking her participation in proceedings designed to justify her execution. She sat in silence during his visits, her expression never betraying emotion or offering insight into motivations that might humanize her actions for potential jurors. Fletcher interpreted her silence as either acceptance of inevitable fate or strategic refusal to provide statements that could be used against her. The truth, which he never discovered, was that Beatrice saw no purpose in explaining herself to people whose fundamental worldview prevented them from understanding why a mother might kill to protect her daughter. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.